Stop. Forget everything you think you know about the space race. You've heard the stories of Apollo, of men walking on the moon, of scientific glory. But there was a darker, far more dangerous parallel race unfolding. A secret war for the ultimate high ground, waged in the shadows by men obsessed with total surveillance. This isn't a story about science. This is a story about a lie. The year is 1965. The U.S. Air Force is building a weapon so ambitious, so politically explosive, it had to be disguised as a peaceful science base. They called it the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL. But the truth? MOL was a military spy fortress. A $3.5 billion pressurized cylinder designed to keep two astronauts alive just long enough to operate the world's most dangerous camera, hovering 150 miles above the Soviet Union. This was the Cold War's ultimate escalation, the fatal flaw. To access their darkroom in the sky, these astronauts had to repeatedly unbolt the heat shield of their reentry capsule. That single, terrifying maneuver, the compromise of the one thing keeping them from burning alive, was an engineering flaw so extreme it should have killed the project immediately. It didn't. The toxic ride. To reach orbit, they were strapped to the Titan 3M, a chemical monster fueled by hypergolic propellants. They weren't riding elegant engines. They were riding a massive, hypertoxic chemical bomb that, with a single leak, would have guaranteed immediate, agonizing death on the launch pad. The billion-dollar obsolescence. And here is the core, almost unbelievable truth. This entire multi-billion-dollar project, this machine that demanded astronauts risk their lives by stripping their own protection, was secretly doomed before the first crew member was even selected. The Pentagon was pouring colossal sums into a manned system built on 1950s logic, utterly blind to the silent, automated technological revolution that was about to render the human spy obsolete. They were investing in a dinosaur while the future was being built in a small, windowless lab across town. The story of MOL is not about a technological failure. It's about a strategic failure of imagination. It is the story of an orbital spy trap built to save America, but whose very existence almost triggered the global conflict it was designed to prevent. The true reason this $3.5 billion monster was abandoned, the single memo that instantly incinerated decades of work, is a forgotten lesson in technological humility. Keep watching, because the full, declassified reason the Air Force's orbital Coffin was never built is one of the greatest acts of strategic retreat in the history of the Cold War. From the moment the project was authorized by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in late 1963, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory was a masterpiece of strategic deception. Officially, the MOL's purpose was to investigate man's usefulness in space for military purposes. This cover story was crucial. The U.S. desperately needed to counter Soviet propaganda and the fear that Moscow was militarizing space. By framing MOL as a laboratory, they maintained a thin veneer of scientific exploration, placating international bodies and avoiding a definitive charge of weaponization. But the reality inside the secretive Air Force System Command was chillingly different. The MOL was a reconnaissance platform, pure and simple. Everything about its design was optimized for spying, sacrificing almost every element of comfort, habitability, and even basic safety. The central, pressurized module was essentially a 40-foot-long metal tube, only 10 feet in diameter. It was designed to be crammed with instruments, control panels, and film storage, leaving precious little room for the two-man crew who would call this steel sardine home for 30 continuous days. The psychological dimension of this mission was a nightmare. Unlike NASA's Apollo and Skylab programs, which incorporated windows for the crew's well-being and to allow them to view the Earth, the MOL's main laboratory section was windowless. The crew would have lived and worked in a relentless, artificial light cycle, seeing the Earth only as a magnified, high-resolution target through the optics of their massive camera system. The KH-10 Dorian. There was no casual stargazing. There was no view to maintain sanity. There was only the scope, the target, and the crushing knowledge of their absolute isolation as military assets. Their existence in orbit was defined by absolute claustrophobia and pressure. The forced proximity of the two crew members, combined with the extreme security surrounding their daily tasks, which involved handling highly classified film and operating the most sophisticated spy equipment of the era, meant that the astronaut selection process prioritized emotional stability above all else. They weren't looking for scientists. They were looking for men who could withstand extreme, sustained psychological confinement while executing a critical military mission. The MOL wasn't designed for human exploration. It was engineered to minimize the space required for two human bodies to sustain life while performing a highly specific, high-stress task. This brutal design philosophy speaks volumes about the true, lethal urgency of the project. But even this suffocating design choice pales in comparison to the insane engineering risk the Air Force authorized for the cruise path between their capsule and their spy station. The structural nightmare at the heart of the MOL was the connection between the laboratory and the Gemini B reentry capsule. For a manned spacecraft to return to Earth from orbit, it relies entirely on a monolithic, heat-ablative shield to withstand the plasma-hot temperatures generated by atmospheric friction. This shield must be perfect, seamless, and completely intact. The MOL engineers decided to cut a large, permanent hole right through it. To allow the astronauts to enter the laboratory module, the Air Force mandated a transfer tunnel that began with a massive hatch cut into the very center of the Gemini capsule's heat shield. This was not a quick fix, it was the core design. Before launch, this section of shield was removable, bolted into place over the inner hatch. Once in orbit, the crew would have to carefully remove the exterior heat shield segment, open the inner hatch, crawl into the lab, and then seal the shield segment back in place before returning to Earth. The sheer audacity of this procedure is stomach-turning. The entire mission's success and the lives of the crew relied on the perfect resealing of a structural component designed to face thousands of degrees of heat. Any tiny misalignment, any bolt not torqued correctly, any damage to the seal would lead to the catastrophic failure of the heat shield during reentry. The atmosphere would burn a hole straight through the capsule, incinerating the crew within seconds. This wasn't merely a risk. It was an existential gamble baked into the project's very architecture. The risk was so profound that engineers spent years developing highly specialized, redundant sealing mechanisms, but the fundamental danger remained. The heat shield was designed to be simple and monolithic for a reason. By breaching it, the Air Force accepted a non-zero chance of thermal destruction on every single mission. The human cost of intelligence gathering had reached an unthinkable level. This decision highlights the desperation of the Pentagon. They believed the information gathered by the human spy was worth this absolute, fundamental risk to life. But the Titan 3M, the rocket that launched them, posed an even more immediate and toxic threat. The men strapped to the core engine weren't just riding a bomb. They were riding a massive, hypertoxic chemical cloud that made the heat shield failure look like a gentle inconvenience to lift the heavy MOL, the two-man Gemini B, and the colossal K-10 camera system. The Air Force needed raw power, and they found it in the Titan 3M. This launch vehicle was a massive, upgraded cousin of the ICBMs designed to carry thermonuclear warheads. It was built for payload and reliability, not astronaut comfort. The sheer violence of the ascent was unprecedented for a manned mission. The Titan 3M utilized twin, 7-segment solid rocket boosters, SRBs, strapped to the core liquid fuel stage. When these boosters ignited, they produced a cataclysmic, bone-rattling thrust that would have subjected the astronauts to forces and vibrations far beyond what NASA civilian programs typically allowed. It was a raw, relentless power surge designed to brute force the heavy spy station into orbit. But the real peril lay in the liquid core stage. The Titan rocket utilized hypergolic fuels, Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide. As we discussed, these fuels ignite spontaneously on contact. They are excellent for reliability in space, but are a catastrophic nightmare on the ground. They are violently reactive, highly corrosive, and profoundly toxic that if a leak occurred on the launch pad, or during the early minutes of ascent through the dense atmosphere. The mixing propellants would instantly flash ignite and simultaneously release a massive, potentially lethal cloud of toxic vapor. For the ground crew, and especially for the two astronauts strapped into the Gemini capsule directly above the core stage, this would have been an instant death sentence, far worse than a conventional explosion. The Air Force had to construct extensive, complex emergency escape systems for the crew, including an ejection seat capability for the early stages of launch, a terrifying testament to the extreme risk inherent in riding this chemical beast. This dedicated, highly dangerous, and customized launch vehicle was responsible for a huge portion of the MOL's staggering $3.5 billion budget. It was an infrastructure built around the premise that this mission had to happen, and it had to be manned. The extreme financial and physical risks were deemed acceptable because the information they sought was considered irreplaceable. But as the hypergolic fuel was being manufactured and the first Titan 3M components were being assembled, the intelligence community was already receiving reports from a rival, unmanned project. These reports proved, with ruthless efficiency, that every dollar spent on keeping a man alive in orbit was a dollar wasted. The most fascinating and tragic element of the MOL project is its timing. It was a program born of 1950s technology and strategic thinking, the belief that the human brain was the ultimate computer. Yet its slow, monumental development cycle meant it was racing against the exponentially accelerating progress of the late 1960s microelectronics revolution. While the Air Force was justifying the cost of life support, radiation shielding, toxic fuel, and human training, the NRO and the CIA were perfecting the K-9 hexagon satellite, the Big Bird. The KH-9 was fully automated, capable of carrying multiple enormous cameras and storing vast amounts of high-resolution film. Crucially, its navigational and targeting systems were evolving at a breakneck pace. Computers and servo motors were rapidly learning to do what the MOL astronaut was specifically trained for: precisely calculate and execute the perfect photographic exposure. The argument for the manned MOL was the man-in-the-loop factor, the ability of a human to diagnose a problem, fix a stuck mechanism, or react to an unexpected target. But the cost of this human flexibility was astronomical. Every single kilogram of life support, every safety measure, every training hour added exponentially to the $3.5 billion price tag. The KH-9, by contrast, was cold, automated efficiency. It had no need for oxygen, food, or a reentry heat shield. The data streaming back from the first unmanned keyhole satellites was undeniable. The automated systems were delivering photographic resolution and mission reliability that equaled, or soon surpassed, the theoretical capabilities of the manned MOL. The Air Force's central premise, that the human was necessary for superior reconnaissance, was collapsing. The human spy was simply too heavy, too expensive, and too vulnerable to justify the massive investment. The technology they were trying to launch was fundamentally obsolete before its launch date. The vast, multi-billion-dollar program was defeated not by a Soviet counter-spy effort, but by the quiet, relentless advance of the silicon chip. The ultimate strategic decision was reached in 1969, a decision so shocking that it wiped the MOL from the history books. But not before the Air Force executed a final, highly classified act that created one of the most remarkable and least known historical footnotes of the entire space race. The MOL was designed in an era defined by fear. The fear was not just of being blind to Soviet capabilities, but the absolute, terrifying fear of orbital weaponization. The Air Force viewed space not as a frontier for exploration, but as a critical military domain. If the Soviets put an arms station in orbit, the US had to have an answer. The manned orbiting laboratory, while primarily a reconnaissance platform, was always conceived with a clear strategic ambiguity. It was built large enough, powerful enough, and with enough excess capacity to be quickly converted into something far more menacing. The station's design included features that raised immediate red flags in Moscow and Washington alike. Its ability to quickly maneuver and adjust its orbit, necessary for precise photography, also made it a highly effective orbital interceptor. This raised the chilling possibility that MOL could be tasked not just with spying, but with approaching and potentially disabling or capturing enemy satellites. This blurred the line between surveillance and space warfare, pushing the boundaries of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which prohibited placing weapons of mass destruction in orbit. The Soviets were not passive observers. They were actively tracking the MOL program's development, viewing the Titan 3M launch vehicle, a military rocket through and the heavily secured launch complex, as undeniable proof of American aggression in space. They interpreted MOL not as a laboratory, but as a covert military outpost. The paranoia on both sides was symmetrical. Moscow had its own highly classified manned military station, Almaz or OPS, designed to carry a rapid-fire cannon for self-defense and satellite interception. The MOL program was thus caught in a destabilizing feedback loop. Its existence accelerated the Soviet Union's own orbital weaponization efforts, which in turn justified the MOL's necessity in the eyes of the Pentagon. It was an orbital arms race based on mutual suspicion and the constant threat of a space skirmish that could quickly cascade into global nuclear war. The high cost of the MOL wasn't just measured in dollars. It was measured in escalating geopolitical risk. For the project to be justified, the intelligence it provided had to be absolutely vital. But the growing efficiency of the unmanned satellites was rapidly eroding that justification, transforming the MOL from a critical strategic asset into an unbearable, multi-billion-dollar liability. Despite the impending technological obsolescence and the rising costs, the MOL program was too deeply invested politically and financially to simply vanish overnight. The Air Force desperately needed to prove the human-in-the-loop concept before the automated alternative completely overwhelmed them. Their solution was a highly classified, unmanned orbital test flight that was designed to mimic the complexity of the Future Man mission. In November 1966, the Air Force launched a single Titan IHC rocket, a less powerful predecessor to the 3M, carrying a prototype MOL structure. The payload was a Gemini B capsule made into a mock-up of the laboratory module. The key elements tested were the structural integrity, the performance of the heat shield plug, and the overall launch dynamics. But the mission had a deeply unsettling psychological element. The Gemini B capsule, which was designed to carry 2 men, was completely empty. It was a ghost ship. To simulate the launch mass and balance of a manned vehicle, the seats were occupied by anthropomorphic dummies, silently riding the hypergolic beast into orbit. This unmanned test proved that the basic concept was sound. The hardware could be launched. But the cost was immense, and the fact remained that the crew's safety, particularly the resealing of the heat shield, could only be proven with a live, human risk. More hauntingly, the capsule, which carried the Gemini B designation, successfully returned to Earth after its brief orbital check, landing in the South Atlantic. It was recovered, examined, and its success was touted as a major step forward. But this single, successful, unmanned flight only deepened the central contradiction of the MOL. The most reliable part of the mission was the hardware. The colossal cost and danger were entirely predicated on the need to carry 2 fragile human beings. Even as the test flight succeeded, the competing automated keyhole programs were quietly launching and returning high-quality film, often at a fraction of the cost per image. The Air Force had proved the technology was possible, but they had failed to prove it was necessary. The fate of the MOL was sealed not by a rocket failure, but by a simple, cold-blooded comparison of the cost per photo, a metric that was about to expose the entire program as a colossal economic folly in the military-industrial complex. Projects are rarely judged by ambition or risk. They are judged by efficiency, specifically the cost per useful output. For the MOL and its unmanned rivals, the metric was the cost per photo. By the late 1960s, this metric became the single, most devastating weapon against the manned space station. The MOL required an infrastructure that was breathtakingly expensive. Each mission necessitated the development, assembly, and launch of the custom Titan 3M rocket, the training and salary of 2 highly specialized astronauts, the maintenance of a dedicated ground control network, and the cost of the single, limited-duration flight. Conservative estimates put the mission cost, excluding the initial $3.5 billion development cost, at hundreds of millions of dollars per flight. The amount of reconnaissance film they could return was limited by the capsule size and the crew's 30-day endurance. Contrast this with the automated KH-9 hexagon. While still expensive, the unmanned system could operate for many months, carry vastly more film, and return multiple separate film capsules via air snatch recovery, greatly increasing the volume of output per launch. Furthermore, the KH-9 was a one-way trip for the hardware, eliminating the need for complex, expensive, and dangerous reentry and recovery systems like the compromised heat shield. When intelligence analysts laid out the spreadsheets for President Nixon's newly appointed advisors, the results were inescapable. The cost per photo from the proposed MOL missions was astronomically higher, by a factor of 10 or more, than the high-volume, reliable output from the automated satellites. The human brain was simply too expensive to keep in orbit to perform a task that a well-designed computer and optical system could now handle. The strategic benefit of the human-in-the-loop was outweighed by the crushing economic reality. The problem was no longer technological. It was fiscal and political. The Air Force brass had invested their professional reputations in the MOL. To cancel it was to admit a catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar misjudgment. But the data was ruthless. The MOL was draining funds that could be better spent on other, more efficient military projects. The stage was set for the final, brutal confrontation between the entrenched pride of the Air Force and the cold, hard economic logic of the White House. The memo that ended the program would not be written by an engineer, but by a powerful, cost-cutting politician focused on ending the multi-billion-dollar embarrassment. The final curtain for the manned orbiting laboratory was drawn not in the vacuum of space, but in the political pressure cooker of Washington, D.C. In 1969, President Richard Nixon assumed office, bringing with him a mandate to restore order to government spending and rationalize the bloated defense budget inherited from the Vietnam War era. The MOL, with its astronomical cost, its technological redundancy, and its politically sensitive military nature, was an immediate target. The cancellation order came down on June 10, 1969, a date that instantly vaporized billions in government spending and shook the Air Force's space aspirations to their core. The decision was formalized by the Bureau of the Budget, which presented the military leadership with the undeniable evidence. The MOL was no longer strategically or economically viable. The quiet efficiency of the unmanned keyhole programs had done its damage. Why spend $3.5 billion on a single, high-risk, limited-duration man lab when automated satellites were already delivering superior intelligence, reliably, and at a fraction of the cost? The Air Force scrambled to find excuses, citing the need for human flexibility and maintenance in orbit. But the response from the White House was cold and final. The technology required to service and maintain satellites in orbit was decades away. In the immediate future, unmanned flyby was the definitive answer. The cancellation was a massive strategic defeat for the Air Force, which had fought tooth and nail to maintain its prestige and control over a manned space program separate from NASA. The announcement was a shock to the public and devastating to the 17 astronauts who had dedicated years of their lives to this ultra-secret mission. They were ready to fly. The rocket was almost ready to launch. But the political and economic reality was inescapable. The orbital coffin would remain on the ground. However, the cancellation left a massive, immediate, and classified problem. What to do with the highly trained, deeply security-vetted astronauts? These were the elite of the U.S. military, men who knew the nation's deepest space surveillance secrets. They couldn't simply be sent back to flying jets. The solution was brilliant, audacious, and completely altered the future of American manned spaceflight in a way no one could have predicted. The termination of the MOL led directly to the creation of an elite, secret corps of astronauts who would go on to command the future of the space shuttle program. A silent transfer of power and expertise that remains one of the most remarkable classified legacies of a never-built project. The immediate fallout from the MOL cancellation created an unprecedented bureaucratic dilemma. The Air Force was left with 17 of the most highly trained, security-cleared, and space-qualified individuals in the world. Men who had been trained for years on the delicate operation of the KH-10 Dorian and the terrifying ascent of the Titan 3M. Their knowledge of classified reconnaissance technology was too sensitive to simply disband them. Yet, the military no longer had a program for them. The solution came from an unexpected source: NASA. At the time, NASA was transitioning from the Apollo moon missions and preparing for the next phase of manned spaceflight, which would eventually become the Space Shuttle program. They needed highly skilled pilots and engineers to fill the ranks of their astronaut corps, and the MOL men were the perfect pre-vetted candidates. The transfer was highly classified and politically sensitive. The Air Force effectively offered NASA a buy one, get 16 free deal on experienced, combat-ready astronauts. In August 1969, 7 of the MOL astronauts were formally transferred to NASA. The names on that list read like a future Hall of Fame of spaceflight: Richard Truly, Robert Crippen, Carol Bobko, Charles Fullerton, Henry Hartsfield Jr., and Donald H. Peterson. They became the core of the new generation of shuttle astronauts. This clandestine transfer had profound implications. These former military spies brought a culture of ruthless efficiency, deep operational knowledge of classified systems, and the steely discipline of the Air Force into the civilian-focused NASA program. The most visible result? The MOL astronauts became the foundation of the Space Shuttle era. Robert Crippen and Richard Truly, 2 men who had trained to fly the orbital Coffin, flew the inaugural Space Shuttle mission, STS-1, in 1981. The very men who were prepared to risk death to spy on the Soviets became the pioneers of America's next civilian space vehicle. The ultimate, silent legacy of the MOL was not the hardware they left rusting in warehouses, but the human capital they rescued. A project designed to fail ended up secretly seeding the future of American spaceflight with its most valuable resource. But as the public story of MOL faded, the actual hardware, the colossal and used machinery and the top-secret optical systems, had to be dismantled, stored, or destroyed. The fate of the full-scale MOL training mock-up is a fascinating, almost mythological tale of an abandoned $3.5 billion ghost ship that was repurposed for a truly bizarre final mission. The abrupt cancellation of the MOL in 1969 left the Air Force with a massive, embarrassing problem: what to do with the physical assets. The program had consumed billions, resulting in fully fabricated components, flight hardware, and a colossal, 2-story training mock-up of the space station itself. This mock-up was a fully articulated, functional model, complete with the Gemini B capsule and the massive KH-10 optical systems installed. It was a tangible ghost of the future that never happened. Most of the flight-ready hardware, including the unused Titan 3M rockets and the specialized reconnaissance components, were either placed into deep, classified storage or destroyed outright to prevent secrets from leaking. But the large-scale training mock-up, the physical representation of the orbital Coffin, was too large and too expensive to simply discard. The final, bizarre fate of the MOL mock-up is a footnote of technological repurposing. NASA, now the beneficiary of the MOL astronauts, inherited the hardware. They quickly realized the unique value of the pressurized cylinder. It was a perfect testbed for long-duration crew habitability studies and equipment testing, which were crucial for the planning of the forthcoming Skylab space station and, later, the Space Shuttle programs. This giant, windowless steel tube, designed for high-stakes military espionage, was stripped of its spy optics and quietly transformed into a civilian engineering tool. It went from being the terrifying KH-10 orbital darkroom to a sterile, functional human factors lab. Scientists used the mock-up to study crew rotation, waste management, and the psychological effects of prolonged confinement. The very factors that would have driven the original MOL crew to the brink of sanity. This act of transformation was a silent admission. The physical structure of MOL was sound, but its intended military mission was bankrupt. The ghost ship of the Air Force was now a life support testing rig for NASA, a final, quiet service before it was eventually decommissioned. It became a monument to the strategic lesson learned. The expensive infrastructure required to support a human in orbit can only be justified if the human is essential. But the greatest secret the MOL guarded was not its camera. It was the chilling truth about the KH-10 Dorian's core functionality, a secret that remains classified to this day and fundamentally alters how we view orbital surveillance. The KH-10 Dorian camera system was the sole reason the Air Force was willing to compromise a heat shield and risk human lives. While we know its official function was high-resolution photography, the deepest, most tightly guarded secret of the KH-10 concerned its operational method and the technology it pioneered. The standard automated keyhole satellites of the era, like the KH-4, used film that was chemically processed after the mission. The MOL, however, offered the potential for something far more immediate. While officially designed to bring the film back to Earth via the reentry capsule, historians and declassified sources suggest the possibility of instantaneous onboard development and scanning. Imagine a photographic system in the 1960s capable of shooting high-resolution film, developing it, and then scanning the image digitally for transmission back to Earth, all in a cramped, orbiting canister. This would have given intelligence analysts near real-time imagery, a capability that was decades ahead of its time. The human crew would not just be calibrating the focus, they would be operating a massive, primitive orbital digital scanner. While full details remain classified, the sheer complexity and cost of the KH-10 strongly suggest it was an experimental platform for imaging technologies that were ultimately incorporated into later unmanned digital systems. The human operator may have been there primarily to test, maintain, and troubleshoot these nascent digital scanning components, which were too unreliable in the 1960s to be fully automated. The MOL was less a spy platform and more a human-assisted technological crucible for the future of digital orbital reconnaissance. This explains why the astronauts were trained so heavily in complex optics and electronics. They were essentially orbital field engineers, debugging a billion-dollar camera system that represented the future of American spying. The cancellation of MOL meant that this highly advanced technology was simply transferred to the unmanned satellite programs, which had finally matured enough to handle the complex operations without human intervention. The MOL didn't fail because the technology was too primitive. It failed because the technology, particularly the KH-10, matured too quickly, leaving the human crew as an expensive, unnecessary appendix to the mission. The sheer paranoia that drove the MOL program was mirrored and arguably amplified by the Soviet Union's own manned military space station, ALMAZ, or OPS. The story of MOL is incomplete without understanding its terrifying, armed counterpart. Just as MOL was disguised as a scientific laboratory, ALMAZ was publicly portrayed as the civilian Salyut series of space stations. But ALMAZ was a fortress. It was designed to house a crew of 3 cosmonauts whose primary mission was orbital reconnaissance and military experimentation. Unlike MOL, which was only implicitly armed through its potential as an interceptor, ALMAZ carried a literal, operational weapon, the Nudelman-Richter R-23M autocannon. This cannon, a modified version of an aircraft gun, was mounted to the front of the station, capable of firing armor-piercing shells at high velocity. The weapon was tested successfully in orbit. A cosmonaut remotely fired the cannon at a target satellite before the station was commanded to deorbit. ALMAZ was, without question, the first and only space station ever armed with a firearm. The existence of ALMAZ and its cannon justifies, in the Cold War context, the desperate fear that fueled the MOL. The US knew the Soviets were militarizing space, and the MOL was their costly, desperate attempt to maintain parity. If MOL had been launched, the 2 military rivals would have had armed, manned outposts hovering over the planet, a scenario that would have made the orbital realm an active zone of potential conflict. The risk of one station misidentifying the other, or a political flashpoint on Earth escalating into a space skirmish, was acute. The fact that the MOL was canceled while the ALMAS program continued to launch with limited success meant that the U.S. conceded the immediate high ground in manned military space. But the U.S. had already won the efficiency race with its unmanned keyhole satellites. The Soviet ALMAS, despite its terrifying cannon, was ultimately a strategic failure, relying on expensive, short-duration manned missions that couldn't compete with the long-endurance, high-volume automated photography being perfected by the NRO. The U.S. chose silence and efficiency. The Soviets chose spectacle and weaponry. The decision to cut the MOL, while painful, ultimately saved billions and shifted the entire focus of space intelligence. But the fate of the MOL astronauts who didn't transfer to NASA remains a story of abrupt professional annihilation, though we know the names of the 7 MOL astronauts who successfully transferred to NASA: Crippen, Truly, Bobko, and the others who became space shuttle legends. But what about the 10 astronauts who did not make the cut, or chose not to transfer? Their story is one of sudden, shocking professional oblivion. These men, the elite of the Air Force, had spent years of their lives in the deepest secrecy, training for the most dangerous, highly specialized mission in American history. They were experts in orbital mechanics, reconnaissance optics, and the hypergolic dangers of the Titan 3M. And in an instant, on June 10, 1969, their future was vaporized. Their entire professional trajectory, their hopes of becoming the first military commanders in space, were reduced to zero. That their knowledge was a double-edged sword. They knew too much about classified systems to simply return to civilian life or even routine military duty without constant surveillance. Their careers were essentially put into a permanent holding pattern. While some continue to serve in high-level Air Force research positions, their dream of reaching space was brutally terminated. This cancellation highlights the fundamental, ruthless reality of military black projects. When a civilian program fails, there are review boards and public inquiries. When a black project fails, it simply vanishes, and the lives and careers of those involved are immediately scrubbed from the public record. The 10 forgotten MOL astronauts were not failures. They were victims of a swift, logical strategic decision that made their skills redundant. They were, in a sense, collateral damage in the war between man and machine. It took years for the Air Force to officially release the MOL astronauts' names and acknowledge the program's existence. The full story of their training, their proximity to the KH-10's true secrets, and the emotional toll of their sudden cancellation is rarely told. They were the ghost crew of the orbital Coffin, forever confined to the margins of space history. The MOL project taught the world a critical, brutal lesson about the nature of technological progress and strategic intelligence. But the ultimate consequence, the real, defining difference between MOL and its rival satellites, was the inherent ethical cost the Air Force was willing to pay. The manned orbiting laboratory ultimately failed because it lost the economic battle to the unmanned KH-9 hexagon. The calculus was simple: zero human risk, lower cost, and higher photographic volume won the day. The cancellation of MOL was a pragmatic, fiscally responsible decision. But the deeper, more profound victory for the unmanned satellite was ethical. The MOL demanded that 2 highly trained men compromise their own safety systems, ride a bomb of toxic fuel, and endure weeks of crushing psychological confinement, all to gain an intelligence advantage that was quickly being matched by automated systems. The Air Force was willing to pay the ultimate price, human life, for a marginal strategic gain. The KH-9 offered the same gain without the cost of human sacrifice. In the most high-stakes game in history, the machines were not only more efficient, they were arguably more humane. The legacy of the MOL is not its failure to fly, but the brutal question it poses: at what point does the perceived value of a human operator, a human eye, or a human brain outweigh the infinite cost and risk to that human life? The Air Force's answer was $3.5 billion and a compromised heat shield. The NRO's answer was a silent, reliable servo motor and zero risk. The technology of automation provided a way out of the ethical trap of the orbital Coffin. The MOL remains one of the greatest what-if questions of the Cold War. If it had launched, it would have been a triumph of military engineering and an orbital flashpoint. Its cancellation was a quiet, necessary retreat that saved lives and money, paving the way for the era of robotic efficiency that now defines space exploration and surveillance. The Manned Orbiting Laboratory was a lie wrapped in secrecy, a spy fortress designed for two men who were rendered obsolete by a quiet microchip. Final call to action, CTA. This $3.5 billion project was abandoned because the US decided that a man in orbit was simply too expensive. But when we look at the immense risk involved, the toxic fuel, the breached heat shield, the claustrophobia, it begs the ultimate question. If the MOL had launched in 1971 and one of its crews had perished due to the heat shield failure, would the world have ever accepted the militarization of space? Or did the failure of this project save us from an armed, orbital conflict? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was the MOL cancellation a colossal mistake or a crucial, life-saving decision that prevented the Cold War from erupting into space?